Use this one or that one?
Does that work?
Okay. Yeah.
Can you hear me? All right. Okay. Louder? All right. Welcome everyone to the inequality session. My task is going to be to give you an overview over the inequality concept, and it will really be something of an overview. I cannot really go into any detail, and also the same with the political ecology introduction yesterday. This is not going to be an authoritative introduction into inequality in the sense that this is the way it is. This is just like my view of this concept of inequality and how it might relate to our field work in the second part of this summer school. So what I'm going to do in the next 40 or so minutes is to throw out at you a couple of concepts and ideas, and your job is going to be to switch on, if you're not already so, and think about like how all of this stuff might relate to your personal or your individual field topics. So this is what I'm going to do. I will first give you a couple of ideas on the inequality concept and how much of a concept inequality actually is. Then I talk a little bit on the relation between inequality, political ecology, and migration. Give you some input on several concepts on inequality in Southeast Asia and also Thailand, and only a couple of words on inequality research. So let's start with the first point, which is actually a very problematic question. How much of a concept is inequality? And we might start with a question that could come from a conservative devil's advocate, if you want. Why all this fuss about inequality? Aren't we unequal in some way? And isn't this actually a good thing? Right? And although this may be a quite deceptive question, there is some truth to it that really goes to the core of the question of how much of a concept inequality really is. And to my personal understanding, I would say it is rather a problematic term and not really a concept. Why? Because just the word and the meaning of the word itself is quite unspecific and diffuse. It can relate basically to everything and therefore to nothing in particular. From that follows that it is combined with various terms that aren't necessarily on an equal plane. So it can be combined with income, gender, power, etc., etc. And another implication of this is that what we mean with inequality is often dealt with under terms that aren't really like mentioning inequality at all, like stratification, differentiation, social structure, domination, hierarchy, so on and so forth. However, there is something that we mean when we talk about inequality, right? And I guess it basically, like what we mean with it boils down to what this pyramid shows us, the global distribution of wealth. So what does this pyramid tell us? It tells us that the top 0.7% of the world's population owns almost half of the global wealth, whereas the lower 70% of the population doesn't even own 3%. So that brings us a little bit closer to a kind of like a definition of what inequality might mean. And as I said, that would be like my point of view, and there are several definitions, I'm sure, about inequality, but what we generally mean, I guess, is inequality is some kind of an unequal distribution of, for example, wealth. But there you go, there's another problematic term here, and maybe the most problematic term. What is wealth? Maybe the problem of inequality depends on how we define wealth. I'm not going to go into that, I just try to be a little bit more specific in sociological terms what inequality might mean. So we could talk about inequality in the sense that it is an unequal distribution of the likelihood to have access to certain social resources, or if you want, life chances, and this is a couple of stuff. It might be money, education, social support, but also land, natural resources, and all of this stuff. In a slightly different sense, we could also talk about inequality as a structural and systemic exclusion of certain social groups from access to resources, social resources. What is important to keep in mind when we talk about inequality is that it is not only economic or material. It is not just about what people possess or don't possess in terms of money or things like that. It is always also symbolic or cultural. It is always also a matter of social classifications, of valuations, and all those things. Second, it is always historical. Social structures and structures of inequality always have a trajectory of change. And what we can see is that inequality almost all over the world and also in Southeast Asia persists through fundamental social change. So social structures may fundamentally change, but still there is inequality out there. And the third point, and I guess that's maybe really one of the central points, is inequality must always be thought in relational terms. So it doesn't help a lot for an understanding of structures of inequality if we, for example, only look at poor people, if we only look at poverty, for example, or if we say we look at poverty and we look at the rich people, but we don't ask how are both related. So to kind of like frankly quote this German poet Bertolt Brecht, if I wasn't poor, you wouldn't be rich. So there is some kind of like a relation between why certain people are poor and other people are rich. So overall, and I guess this links again to what Carl was talking about yesterday, although he had a little bit of different opinion about it, inequality seems to be an issue of justice. And first of all, an issue of distributional justice, the distribution of social resources or access to them. And in another sense, we could also say that capitalism, that is the kind of society that we are all living in, unfortunately, systemically produces inequality because it draws on the class relation and it systemically exploits unequal valuations, for example, between the genders or several standards in terms of environmental or social standards. We know this story. To give you a quick overview of like the roots of like inequality thinking, we might start with this guy over here that hopefully every one of you knows, Karl Marx, and his notion of class as the relation between capital on the one hand, wage labor on the other, and the relation between both is conceptualized by him as a relation of exploitation. We might also add relations of appropriation, for example. Another guy that was quite important and that tried to complement Marx in a sense was Max Weber. He said, well, Marx wasn't exactly wrong with what he said, it was just a reductionist idea, and from a sociological perspective we should be a little bit more differentiating about this. There aren't, when we look at society, not only capitalists and wage laborers, but we have like various classes, status groups, what he calls parties, and so on and so forth. So we have to look beyond the core thing of economic production. We also have to look at rank, status, and all of those things. A third guy that also kind of like somehow uneasily relates to Max Weber was, of course, Emile Durkheim and his idea of organic solidarity, for example. And what he means with organic solidarity is the functional differentiation of labor, which was for him a good thing. So he basically saw society as kind of like a body where you have like different organs that are contributing to the life of society. So this, what he calls differentiation, was basically a good thing. And he also had this concept of social facts. I cannot really go into that. But if we combine, for example, Max Weber and Emile Durkheim, we might arrive at this guy here, Tucker Parsons, who was one of the leading figures in structural functionalism, in sociology, systems theory, and he also used and was quite of a proponent in stratification thinking. So this guy is not for nothing on the right side of this slide. And I cannot actually tell you a lot about Talcott Parsons. I would like to draw your attention to a combination of Marx, Weber, and Bourdieu, and Durkheim, and we arrive at Pierre Bourdieu, who is, to my understanding, at least more on the left side of not only the slide, but also the political spectrum. And his ideas about capital, social space, habitus, milieu, and symbolic violence. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this in a second. But in this constellation here, we can surely add like way more proponents of inequality thinking if we want. But I guess key dichotomy in inequality thinking is basically the one between class and strata. So we have like this class idea coming from Marx, for example, where class is thought of as a structural position in the social production process. This concept of class tends to relate to social conflict. It is rather an explanatory category, and it tends to be critical of society and the social reality, whereas stratification thinking comes more from the empirical side, and it conceptualizes inequality more as a bundle of several empirical indicators. They are more concerned with social integration, social peace, and all those things. They are rather descriptive and rather affirmative. So let's talk a little bit more about Pierre Bourdieu, because I think that might help us also to kind of like structure a little bit inequality research in the villages or in the field site that we are going to. So one concept of Pierre Bourdieu is that of social space. So we might say that this is actually, like in a very abstract sense, how society looks for Pierre Bourdieu, right? It has like various dimensions. So we have, for example, on the vertical axis, the increasing amount of capital overall, but he has an idea of various sorts of capital. So when we go on the horizontal plane, we have like different compositions of capital, and that is according to economic capital and cultural capital. So the further we move to the right, we could say, the more economic capital we got, and the further to the left side we are, the more cultural capital we have. So cultural capital, education, knowledge, and all of those things. Economic capital, the classic stuff, income, property, inheritance. And then we have like this third dimension of history, so the trajectory, if you want, of social actors in terms of like upward mobility, downward mobility through time. I'm not concerned too much with this history axis right now, although this is very important. And he also has, and that is quite a particular thing about him, I guess, because he somehow combines stratification thinking and class thinking, a notion of a field of power in the upper echelons of across the social spectrum, if you want. So now if we do research, for example, and check like various sorts of capital, especially cultural capital and economic capital, we might find, for example, there is a group of individuals that have the same amount and the same composition of capital that is rather like in this sphere, and then we might find several other groups, right? And more to the left side here, where you have a lot of cultural capital, we might say, this might be us academics, for example. Yeah, some of them are in the field of power, some of them are struggling to survive somehow. And as I said, the more you move to the right, the more it is like economic capital that is kind of like making up the assets of one actor. So now we have those groupings of several actors, and then Pierre Bourdieu comes and says, okay, let's just group them together and term the group milieu. This is basically actors that have a similar social position, and then we can look at the dispositions of the actors themselves. This is what he calls habitus. And now I would like to talk a little bit more about those concepts of milieu, habitus, and capitals and how they relate to one another. So for Pierre Bourdieu, capitals are, and this is a little bit different from Marx, are actually certain kinds of resources, or if you want, access to certain kinds of life chances. And he distinguishes not only economic and cultural capital, but also social and symbolic capital. I'm going to come back to this when I talk about the research. For Bourdieu, capitals exist basically in two aggregate states. On the one hand, in milieus, what he says, what he terms objectified capital, so objectified in the social positions, and he conceptualizes milieus as, if you want, socio-cultural environments where you have like certain ideas about the social world, about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, and they are always linked in some way to the system of the division of labor. And those are basically environments where certain habitus are nurtured. And what is habitus now? Like this is maybe the most famous concept of Pierre Bourdieu. So this is basically the idea that actors have certain dispositions that are actually like really physical and bodily, and not just ideological, if you want. They are really internalized social positions which guide practice, so that the practice of individual actors tends to reproduce the social position of the actor, so that in the end, and this is maybe overstressing the case, but this is also an interesting point that we shouldn't forget, that actors that are socialized in certain realms of the society tend to desire what they are socially entitled to. This is what he calls amor fati, or the life, one's love of one's social destiny, for example. So people want what they already got and what they can achieve, basically. So if we differentiate this a little bit, then as we saw in the slide before, we have like several habitus, we have several milieus, and certain milieus and certain habitus correspond to one another, but there are like forces that push the milieus and the habitus apart from one another. This is indicated by the red lines. And this whole thing basically is might be termed what Pierre Bourdieu calls distinction. That is basically the argument that the class relation is not just an economic relation, it is also a cultural relation. And basically everything about us, all our behavior, what we dress, what we like to eat, or what we don't like to eat, up until what we want to achieve, what our aspirations are, those are functions of the class relation. And basically we cannot really get out of this. So the way we talk, the way we relate to people tends to reproduce the class relation in a society. That is basically his main point, I guess. Cannot go into any detail here. We can discuss this a little bit more if you want. I would like to get to another concept that is tightly related to that. And this is the concept of symbolic violence. I'm sorry I couldn't make a fancy, colorful slide out of this one. But I guess it's also a quite important point to make, actually. Bourdieu argues that those who are basically in a dominated position in a society perceive themselves and their dominated position in terms of the dominating worldview, because they share common ideologies why certain social distinctions are legitimate. And this is due to the habitus and to being raised in certain social strata. So you kind of like internalize the distinctions of the social world according to the hegemonic worldview of the dominating class. So that in the end, the dominated are kind of like forced to actively reproduce their inferior positions by at least partly not really recognizing that that certain kinds of behavior actually reproduce dominated positions. So that's this issue of amor fati that I was just referring to. But another point is in Pierre Bourdieu that even those guys who are dominating, the dominators, so to speak, are themselves in a sense dominated by the whole social system and the symbolic order that kind of like supports and reproduces social inequality in terms of honor, for example, in terms of what you think you own to yourself, things like that. So the basic message here would be that the recognition of the social world, the way how we see the social world, is actually based on a misrecognition of the social world as a natural order of things. So we might want to keep this in mind and see if this is going to get us anywhere also in terms of our future research, perhaps. To step back from Bourdieu, more generally, just because this is very important, I guess, for our research, is a couple of dimensions of inequality, which is, of course, property and education, all those things, but gender is, for Bourdieu, is really the basic inequality relation in a society. But we also have all the stuff that you already know about, ethnicity, or in some countries is even allowed to still use the notion of race, religion, nationality, but also sexuality, age, and not least the center-periphery relation could be expressed in several ways, Thailand or Laos or Vietnam. It could be the lowland-highland relation, for example, or the north-south relation, yeah, like Austria, Germany here, and Vietnam and Thailand there, or the town-village relation, and so on and so forth. And there might be a couple of others that you can think about and that we could maybe talk about a little bit more if you want. Okay, so that's so far on the first point, the inequality concept, and that was actually also the longest part of my talk. I would like to say at least a couple of words on the relation between inequality, political ecology, and migration from my point of view. So me as a sociologist dealing a lot with inequality, I would say that inequality is constitutive of any society that we know about. So it is per se implied already in any political, ecological, or migration problems that we may come across. Or we might even hypothesize that political ecology and migration is triggered by evolving through and resulting in inequality in one way or the other. Or if you want, the class relation. But this is decidedly not to say that this is necessarily and always so, because what we learn from sociology, and especially from Bourdieu, is that inequality isn't natural. Inequality is based on naturalization in the sense that I was just talking about, but it isn't natural. It can be done away with, in principle, and it can be different. So, on the one hand, we have this inequality basically as an underlying factor to my understanding of the other things. And it means basically the unequal distribution of social resources, if you want. So when we look at political ecology, I would say this is actually happening within the field of inequality. And there we have to deal with, as we heard yesterday, unequal, quote-unquote, natural resource access and land use. When we have this inequality perspective, we might see that natural resources aren't actually natural, but they are also social resources somehow. And political ecology is, as we heard, dealing with the costs versus the benefits of environment-related actions, for example. So political ecology is somewhat overlapping with migration. I'm not really a migration expert, but I would say that also, or most forms of migration are in one way or the other driven by inequality and/or resulting aspirations in one way or the other. For example, many forms of migration proceed along a wealth gap in some sense. A very common problem is that migrants are often vulnerable in the place, in their destination. So often they form the lower strata of the societies that they are migrating to. And the issue of remittances is, of course, also kind of related to inequality and poverty and all those things. So those were basically my comments on this issue. We can discuss this if you are of a different opinion when it comes to how all those things related. Would be good to discuss this. Just one example that I came across in a text that I recently read. on transnational marriages in Taiwan when it comes to marrying or actually buying women from Vietnam. Yeah? And in this text, there was a quote of an advertisement for Taiwanese men marrying or buying Vietnamese women. And they argue, why should you do that? Well, if you buy a Vietnamese woman, she can work. Yeah? So the income of the household will increase. She will sleep with you, so you can save your money for the whorehouse. She may do the housework, which saves you money. And she will produce you a male heir, which is like invaluable. So why don't you get married? I guess this little snippet already tells us a lot about how inequality works. Yeah? Women are used here just as useful means or objects for men who are actually the subjects. And this is a kind of structure that you find all over the place, everywhere, maybe not that explicitly, but in one way or the other. Well, let me get to my third point on inequality in Southeast Asia and Thailand. I'm not actually really going to tell you a lot about inequality and stratification in Thailand because we will have a separate talk on this. But I might refer you back to one of the texts that I uploaded to read, this text by Basuk on the wealthy people in Thai society, which I found was a quite astonishingly interesting text about it and quite explicit too. So you might want to have a look at this if you haven't already. I would just like to come up with a couple of concepts that were used to conceptualize inequality in the area of Southeast Asia. First thing, Wittvogel's idea of hydraulic society. He was drawing on Marx's idea of the Asiatic mode of production and tried to develop that further. And his argument was that, so to speak, Oriental states, which he referred mainly to China, but he was also referring to ancient Egypt, for example, or even like the Mayan kingdom in the Americas. But the argument was that Oriental states are based on large-scale hydraulic projects. And when you think about China, that rings true to some degree. And those large-scale hydraulic projects require a strong central power. And this is basically what he calls the despot, or like the king, the emperor, if you want, and his bureaucratic managerial apparatus. So they form the ruling class, which appropriates the surplus that is produced by the ruled class. So the despot is the one who is in full control of land and water, and he is also the head of some sort of state cult in one way or the other. And you have the bureaucracy of like various officials who are maintained by corvée labor and the taxes of the ruled class. The ruled class are basically the immediate producers, like the peasants, but also artisans, merchants, and slaves. So this concept of hydraulic society was also at some point applied to Thailand by Thai scholars, but eventually it was abandoned, and it was argued that this doesn't actually really apply to Thailand. But yeah, it had some relation even to Thailand, but also to other places in Southeast Asia. And the other one, and this is really a quite dynamic and concept that talks a lot about like societal transformation, the idea of strategic groups put forward by Evers, where he argued that in times of fundamental social transformation, like for example in colonialism or post-colonialism in Southeast Asia, there's a formation of new powerful positions due to new possibilities and new resources opening up. So there are new interest groups that might form what he calls strategic groups, and those groups tend to be like from the upper echelons of the old social structure, with like certain kinds of riches they already accumulated. They form strategic groups somehow as political pressure groups, and then integrate themselves into a new, let's say, the colonial social structure, also in the upper ranks again. So for example, in the colonial state, with its new institutions like education institutions, bureaucratic institutions, and so on and so forth. We have new actors coming up, like independent professionals, civil servants, military officers, but also more, that might form such groups, for example. And also in modernization, like post-colonial and like recent times, and we see this quite readily in Laos, for example, but also in Vietnam and perhaps also in Thailand. Stuff like foreign aid and capital investments might contribute to form a strong domestic upper class. And this concept of strategic groups, as far as I know, has also been applied to Thailand by my colleague Olli in his dissertation. Maybe he wants to elaborate on that at some point. But another thing is that Evers and his colleagues, they combined both those concepts, the hydraulic society and the strategic groups, to kind of conceptualize water management in the Mekong Delta before and after Doi Moi, for example. That's also an interesting thing to look at. I'm not really going into any details here, but just to say that this stuff is being applied today with regard to the countries that we are looking at and that most of you or many of you are coming from. The third concept, and that's the last concept that I'm going to talk about, is the so-called peasant question, if you want. Those of you who read the article, The Last Peasant, that I was uploading to the repository, you might recognize this table. And you might be aware of the whole discipline, you could say, of peasant studies, and one of the founding fathers, if you want, James Scott, and other people who followed his lead, like Ben Kerkvliet, who was basically working on Vietnam as well, who argued that peasants are a distinct group in Southeast Asian societies, and they are characterized by subsistence agriculture. They tend to not accumulate capital, they are risk averse, they have like rather shallow village inequalities, they are defined by their powerlessness and everyday forms of resistance, for example. And now guys like Robert Daly come and say, well, yeah, that was a useful concept for some time, but when we look at Thailand today, this isn't actually the case anymore, and if we still apply this idea of peasants to the current reality of Thai society today, then we are actually kind of like misconceiving what is really going on. We should rather talk about farmers today and about and see that those people that have been conceptualized as peasants are actually heavily involved in marketized agriculture. They, to some degree, accumulate capital. They are rather entrepreneurial than risk averse. And conspicuous consumption, which is basically directly relating to Bourdieu again, plays a role in those societies today. And it is, we are not only talking about, or not so much more talking about everyday forms of resistance, but we see that farmers today are rather seeking state benefits, are seeking political representation and integration into the mainstream society, if we want. And basically, the peasant argument was peasants are kind of like a class, like a suppressed class. They are basically what in the West are the wage laborers. And now farmers cannot be conceptualized so much as wage laborers, or not all of them, but rather they are entrepreneurs or like businessmen in some sense. So just to make you aware of this, I guess this is really like an important thing for many, or at least some of our field sites. Think about this lens. And this is already what brings me to, maybe one other thing is that this argument might apply to Thailand, that we cannot talk about farmers anymore, but I'm not sure if this is true, for example, for Laos. Laos might be on that way, but as far as I can tell, there's a lot of subsistence production still going on, so it's really depending on the context, and we can discuss how it looks like in Vietnam, for example. And also we could discuss whether this dichotomy is actually true, right? Or if there are much more nuanced, if this is more like a continuum and we have like a couple of steps in between a peasant and a farmer still today, even in Thailand. Yeah, this is stuff that we might think about and that we might also kind of like explore in the villages that we are, and that brings me to the inequality research. So just a couple of notes on that. To my understanding, inequality is rather a lens that we might look through at reality and not so much a certain thing to look at. So we cannot just like go out there and see inequality out there, right? We have to put on a certain lens in order to recognize that this stuff that we are just seeing is actually about inequality. And the thing that is related is that there is, at least to my understanding, no real fixed method or methodology to inquire or to examine inequality. We have quantitative and qualitative methods, and we need actually both of this. I would suggest, or I would imagine that in the framework that we are in now, we might tend to work more qualitatively because we just don't have the capacities to really work in a quantitative way, but if we can, the better. Just a quick note on methods. We are going to hear more about methods by Professor Antweiler in the day after tomorrow, I guess. So just like some general remarks on that. To my understanding, there are a lot of like fancy and elaborate methods that we could use to examine a lot of stuff. But when it comes down to the basic things, what all of us should be kind of like capable of is first observation, yeah? And second is conversation. Well, in the villages, most of us, we won't be able to actually like talk to people, right? We have to go through translators because we don't know the local language. But what all of us can do is observe. So I would like to urge you to practice observation. There is a lot of stuff that you can get out from just observing things if you do it in the right way. So I will give you a quick example in a minute, but those are really like important basic things that can tell you a lot about the social reality. So, and if we combine those two things with regard to one subject or object, then this is what's called triangulation. So what people tell you is one thing, what you can observe is another thing. So one guy says, oh, I'm the poorest guy in the village, and then he takes off in a Rolls Royce, then there's obviously some kind of, I don't know, contradiction there, right? So we kind of need at least like two methods to really like get at what is actually going on. So what are we looking at when it comes to inequality? We might go back to Pierre Bourdieu here and maybe look at various forms of capital, of having or not having economic, cultural, social, or symbolic capital. So we were talking about economic and cultural capital already. What Bourdieu means with social capital is basically social networks, social relations, acquaintances, how many people you know, what kinds of people you know, all those things. And symbolic capital to Bourdieu is actually a very specific form of capital for him. And that relates to things like who in a community is granted with credibility by the other people for certain reasons, because he has or she has a certain status, for example. And therefore, this person has a lot of influence, is recognized as like an important guy, or misrecognized as someone who can be neglected or something. Those things, I guess, can be observed or can be like found out in one way or the other. What we also can find out, or what's a good access, is actually habitus. We could look at what's the attitude of people, what kinds of values do they communicate, but also simple things like how do they dress, for example, and all those things. What's their posture? Yeah, how do they move through a village, for example? What's their mindset? Those are things that are readily accessible in one way or the other. We might look at relations between households or between individuals, like which kinds of dependencies are there, which kinds of conflicts are there. We might look at interactions between people or between households. Are they symmetric or asymmetric? We can look at social classifications. So how does one social group classify the others, for example? We have to look, actually, when it comes to inequality, at the division of labor. Yeah? Who labors, who is basically a laborer who doesn't have to work, for example, because he or she owns the land. Yeah? And how is labor divided between the genders, for example, or between like migrants and the people who stayed there for a longer time, all those things. We might look at very easy, yeah, types of housing, like how are the houses looking like? How is the village laid out? How is the infrastructure working? Yeah? Is electricity lines, do they go to all houses, or do they just go to some houses? That tells you a lot already about like who's powerful and who's not, without talking to anyone. And of course, we have to look at those different dimensions that I was just referring to: ethnicity, gender, religion, and all of this stuff. And there might be more. So much about inequality research, and now I'm really just like giving a quick example of how cool observation can actually be. So this is a classic example that is always brought up in sociology classes in Germany. It was really a groundbreaking study in the 1930s in Austria, titled "The Jobless of Marienthal." Yeah? It was a study about a workers' estate that was struck by joblessness after a factory closing in the 1930s. And the researchers came up with a lot of innovative methods, also quite debatable, some on ethical grounds. But one thing that struck me as quite innovative was that they just rented a hotel room and looked out of the window. And they measured the walking speed of 50 people walking by. And what they came up with was they saw that there is a dual time experience in that community. Women walk faster than men because they still have duties, whereas men are all struck with joblessness, don't know what they do, so they walk slower. This is stuff that you can readily observe, right? So this idea, for example, to kind of like access the socioeconomic situation via the walking speed of people that tells you something about the time experience of the actors, it can be really easy if you're innovative enough to come up with innovative methods, I guess, that don't necessarily have to be like very elaborate, yeah? Especially when you're quite foreign to a place. So observation is key, and that brings me to my conclusion. Or implications, and this should be taken as hypothesis from my point of view. We can debate everything of this that I was just talking about. So to my understanding, inequality is a basic social condition. It is not natural, it can be done away with in principle, but it is basic. So no existing society is understood without some concept of inequality, to my understanding. In capitalism, most of the inequalities that we are empirically investigating actually boil down in the end, in one way or the other, to the class relation. Another point that I was just quickly alluding to, and it seems to be an important point, is that from my understanding, solutions of environmental or political ecological problems and migration problems might lie not so much in the fact of migration and not so much in the fact that there are environmental problems, but actually the solution lies in the social relations and in the unequal social relations and in ways of overcoming inequality. So as soon as we kind of like overcoming the class relation, then maybe other kinds of problems that we perceive as political ecological or as migration problems might solve themselves in a way. The question still is how to overcome the class relation, right? But a point that I also would like to make, and I guess this is where Carl had a slightly different opinion. I think that talking or being concerned about inequality actually already implies normativity. So if we care about inequality, then this isn't a neutral thing. Then we actually already mean in some implicit way that we actually care about equality. And this is already in the form of the term itself. It is actually equality put into negative term. And that might also relate to my last point, that inequality in one way or the other might imply discontent already, at least among the people that are in an unequal social position. So there might be some kinds of aspirations or emancipatory ambitions. And perhaps this might be one of the key points that our key aspect here, transdisciplinary research, might access or attach to. And that was basically it. Here are my references, and I thank you a lot for your attention. Any questions, or better, any answers? Everything clear or unclear? Gee. There's no one to...
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the presentation. My question is, like, where's the need or the use to know these concepts from Bourdieu and ethos, because they are just describing the reproduction of inequality systems, and that they are being like a kind of loop. So in their concepts, there isn't space for change. And
True.
My question is, we are dealing with TDR, and so with this research, we want to change something. So wouldn't it be better to use concepts of change, or to deal with concepts of change, instead of dealing with classical concepts which are like already like not fitting our research method?
Mm-hmm. Great question. That is actually really going really to the heart of the problem of Bourdieu's theory in some way, yeah, because this is really a reproductive optic somehow. But I think this is still an important thing, because this is the strong point that he makes. He looks at all those things, or his basic question is actually, why is there still inequality around if no one actually wants inequality, or if there are so many people who are actually disadvantaged by a social system? And he looks at, like, how does it still reproduce? You know, and I guess this doesn't help us a lot with the change question. This is true, but it helps us to see what factors are standing against change, and how deeply ingrained those factors are in our everyday practice and our everyday behavior and all those things. So I guess in that sense, to make us aware of all those tiny little, it might be gestures, it might be just the way you talk, your tone or whatever, you know, that tends to reproduce those things. And to make us aware of this is kind of like, in a negative way, I think, still somehow helpful when it comes to, he's also interested in change, you know. And when you read his stuff, you really have like a dualism somehow between his concepts, which are really only about reproduction, at least to my understanding. There are other scholars who would say, no, Pierre Bourdieu is actually much more dynamic and things like that. But to my understanding, it's really more about reproduction. But the way he puts this stuff is really like, this shouldn't be like that. Distinction is a bad thing. You know, we have to get beyond that. And we can only go beyond that if we are fully aware of how distinction and how reproduction really works. But you're right, we have to, in that sense, also go beyond Bourdieu and think about like, how can we add to that? You know? And that might be one thing that we should discuss among ourselves. I don't have a ready answer to that, sorry. But maybe someone else has. You have?
Yeah. That was your answer, yeah. No, okay. Well, I think Eva's, to your question, Gina, So the strategic group concept is actually about how historical change happens. So basically, they're arguing that as new social groups emerge based on the appropriation of new resources or different types of resources, that they then become powerful and start changing the political system. And they used the 1932 revolution in Thailand as an example, where in the absolute monarchy, where the monarchy centralized state power, actually this gave rise to a new class of bureaucrats who were commoners and who were not part of the royal family. And this was actually the new social force that led the 1932 revolution against the absolutist monarchy in Thailand. That was one example. And this is actually then goes back to Karl Marx and in his concept of class, which Michel mentioned but didn't really go into in so much detail. And of course for Marx, class was more than just a kind of description of different strata, but it was actually the motor of history, if you will. So he wasn't just talking about class as a descriptive category, but as he was talking about class struggle. So the relation between different groups of people in society, and how this then creates historical change. And the classic example is, of course, the rise of the bourgeoisie. Yeah, so who emerged economically in feudalist societies, but then led revolutions to impose their own political system. Yeah? And so the last point is then, if we look at it today, in a capitalist society, Marx didn't reduce it to capital and wage laborers. He was actually arguing that capitalism is reducing everything to this relation. So the more capitalism expands, the more different classes are actually reduced to this relation. And this is the point about agrarian change. If we look at the articles about Thailand, that's what's happening. The peasant class is basically dissolving, and you get a differentiation. It's not just that the farmers are entrepreneurs, but actually they're using wage labor. So the example was the longan orchards, where some farmers have managed to create their orchards, but they're using migrant labor from Burma. And this, the point about this is then this is a class relation which is constantly in contradiction with each other. So capital is a relation, and that's where change comes from, because they're constantly fighting around how much wage labor do you get and the conditions of work and all this kind of thing. So this is the kind of the potential for change in the Marxist perspective.
Anything else? We have a lot of time. Who's first? Yes, yeah.
My question is, because in your presentation you mentioned about Vietnamese case, the marriage from of the Vietnamese woman married to Taiwanese, and there is one inequality happens. So I would like to understand more about that case, because in my opinion, the people who before there are three states of people who want to get married. The first, in the beginning, they have they think about who they want to marry, and the second stage they decide to marry, and the last stage they have to be responsible for that decision. So my opinion, the inequality just happened in the third stage only, because in the concept that you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that the inequality happened because unequal distribution, especially wealth. Yeah. So if
what you mean with wealth.
Yeah, for example, if the person who decides to marry with one person, the girl, I mean, so she have to know, intend to do that. she intends to do that. But for the inequality, there is no unintended decision for that. So I don't know, in that case, is there any inequality happen, and can you explain more about that?
Oh.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
so your point would be that because it is a free decision of the lady, it doesn't have to do with inequality? Is that right?
Because the lady who want to get married, that is intended decision. So there is no inequality before marriage. But after the marriage, she doesn't know anything happen in the future. So maybe in the future there is something else. Maybe you say that if you get if the Taiwanese man get married to a foreigner and she have to work $600 something. I don't remember exactly. But in that case, the girl, they didn't know that the situation will happen in the future. But before that, she intended to do that. So there is no inequality. This is her choice. Yeah, this is my opinion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I mean, may I quickly, just a quick reply. I just read this article, and I might send it to you. It might be really interesting. I guess there's, like, to my understanding, there's inequality implied, like, through the whole thing. It starts already with who is actually going, from the Taiwanese guys, who is actually going to want to marry a Vietnamese woman and not a Chinese woman, or not, like, say, a Ukrainian woman, for example. So those who are going to want to marry a Vietnamese woman are already people in Taiwanese society that are actually already disadvantaged. So there's inequality right there. Then on the Vietnamese side, I mean, you might know better, yeah, but I had the feeling that, at least from what the article said, it was the decision whether to marry or not to marry was entirely the man's decision, because the woman herself, it was clear. It was kind of clear she's going to marry one of those guys who comes to the village. It just depends on if the guy wants her or not. And there were also, in the seminar that we were talking about this, and the student who gave her presentation on that, she also showed a slide from Singapore when it also came to Vietnamese women. And this was really, there was really advertisement to buy them. It was really a sales agreement somehow. So I don't know. I cannot really share this opinion that.
If we sell something that the things cannot decide whether they are sold or not, but the women they are agreed to marry to that girl, that man. So they agree to do like that. So I think that is their choice.
Yeah. Well, the whole point about, or one point about Bourdieu's theory would be, for example, that just because someone freely decides and freely wants to do that doesn't mean that no inequality is involved. Yeah? It's maybe not. Yeah. It's maybe not that easy. So I guess we have to have a closer look at that case. Yeah. But yeah, it's important. Who has the microphone? Yeah.
Maybe a point I want to add to that. I don't know if you can talk about a free decision here, because you always have to look at the context.
Right.
There are several other examples, like, for example, if we look at slavery, if you have the context of slavery and then the slaves has to a certain extent a decision whether they want to be in the position of, like, if we talk about female slaves, for example, that they have this decision whether they want to work on the field or sleep with their owner. I don't know if you can talk there about a free decision. So I think you always have to see it in relation to the context, to the situation and stuff. Just add in as a comment.
In Vietnamese case, the women, when they get older, so in the age to get married to the man. So if they have a lot of choice, they can get to the local. Can get married to the local man, or they can get married to the foreigner. Because here, one thing related here, I can listen from the presentation. One thing related here is because of the poverty, the family condition. I mean the economic situation, because maybe their family needs some support from them, and this is affected to their decision. But totally, they can make another decision. Maybe they go to another big city to do a job and hard working and to earn the money to support back to the family. But the choice is they can choose another solution. They choose to get married with the foreigner to make their life happier. So this is the choice, not like the slaver.
And then after your discussion about the slavery, but I think that like the worker or the employee, something like that, you have to sign the document that you have to permit, you have to work 8 hours per day or 40 hours per week, something like that. And you mean like that's some document that we have to sign with them like that?
But as you mentioned, there's some like social forces that they have to marry. Like
They don't have
No,
to.
they don't have
This
to
is
any
their
folks.
choice.
That's a choice.
wouldn't you say, like you said, that there's a certain age where a woman in Vietnam can get married? After that, it's like she's too old.
No.
So there's a societal force?
They can freely make the decision.
Yeah.
For example, they can get married, or they cannot get married, or they can get married to the local man or foreigner man. This is their decision. They can make their own decision. No one can force them. But in the case he mentioned, I know that they have, because of the girl who want to get married with the foreigner, they need to register to the center, the marriage center, and then they come to that center, and they bring the foreigner to the center, and the foreigner can choose the girl. But if without the agreement from the girl, so the man cannot choose anyone else. Okay. Yeah.
So, but maybe we can just ask also in terms more generally when it comes to migration, why do they decide to marry abroad? What's the reason?
Yeah, a lot of factors affected to their decision. Maybe family income need to be increased to support to the family.
There you go.
Yeah. And
Inequality
maybe they
right
want
there.
to have the better life.
Inequality right there.
Yep. Right there.
But they can have another choice. Maybe they
Yeah,
can
but
work harder.
then they remain poor. Inequality right there. Sorry.
I think you're talking about inequality on another level. Like she chooses something, that's right. But she has to choose because she wants to support her family. If she didn't have to support her family, maybe she wouldn't. And on the other level, it's the other way around. Why aren't women coming to choose men? It's like the man coming and they choose the woman. It's not the woman who says, okay, I want this man. So it's another level on inequality. I think you're talking about that. Yeah, it's her decision. I will do this to support my family, but there is still inequality on structural basis.
I would like to have an idea about this situation. I think that even if they accept or they freely to give the decision to get married with foreigner, anyway they have inequality, accept to the inequality conception, because they have to move to the foreign country, and they have to be controlled by the regulation and even legal or illegal regulation. So that is also the inequality, accepting to the conception, I think so.
not the concept of inequality or equality. The gender question is not the question of inequality or equality.
Didn't get that one. That was too silent, unfortunately.
Yes, please.
So I'm assuming that the question of marriage to that man or this man is the question of gender issue. It's not the question of inequality or equality.
Sorry.
Yes,
We have the right to get married.
but I mean, but I see that she gives a question that is not inequality according to his notion, because he gives that is the girl freely to give the decision, the choice. But anyway, according to the concept of inequality, she have to accept. That she have to accept any regulation or any the order from the foreigner country and community and even husband. So that means she is vulnerable, because if she stay in her country, she control everything. But in the foreigner country, she is more vulnerable. So that is inequality, I think.
Yeah, I just feel that we talk about very different kinds of inequality, or we have a very different concept. But for me, it is inequality if a woman in Bangladesh, for example, has to work in a factory. Sure, maybe she can choose between two factories, but it's still her position, her poverty that forces her to actually get a job in a really bad situation. And even if she can choose between two bad situations, it's still inequality for me. And I think this is also what was kind of lacking in the a little bit in the presentation, was intersectionality, that we more considered, hey, gender aspects, it's not just class, but it's gender, it's race, it's religion, it's, I don't know, all these factors that really play into it. And I think maybe because you also just said gender is not necessarily inequality, for me it is, because this is one of the biggest inequalities, maybe not one of the biggest, but definitely a very important factor of inequalities in general, that a woman, in this case, maybe even doesn't have the choice to get a proper education, to decide not to get married or to stay at home, and just that she has to support her family, and that her family may get some money from that, already has inequality in it for me. And so I think it's very difficult that we already talk about different kind of inequalities and that we don't talk about the same thing. At least that's what I think here. Yeah.
Can I say something to that? Because that was actually my first point to make, right? That inequality isn't actually a concept; it's way too blurry, and this is really a danger when we use such blurry concepts. We might talk about stuff, use the same words, but mean totally different things. So we actually have to be more specific about that, and maybe find other terms that would be a little bit more concrete on what we're actually talking about. Totally agree.
Can I quickly say something? Because that was my point as well. I think you were very clear on class as a very major factor in terms of inequality. But I think, yeah, like you said, inequality is such a blurry term. It does help to deconstruct it and kind of see what lies behind it. And I feel in terms of gender, age, or disability, or any of those other social categories, you were a bit less precise. And I think we can look at them being the basis of discrimination or privilege that leads to inequality. I think you referred at some point to gender as a form of inequality, but I think it is a form of discrimination towards, for example, gender or class that leads to inequality. It's not just inequality, like gender is not the inequality, you know. The discrimination of gender leads to inequalities such as economic inequality or questions of participation or whatever else. Yeah.
Right.
You might see that differently. I don't know. Maybe you can say something.
I don't know if I really got that right, but I was trying to make the point that gender is actually like a very basic and very important dimension of this whole conundrum that we are talking about when it comes to inequality. And the question is really like, what triggers what? So is inequality what constructs gender differences, or are gender differences basically what lead to inequality? Like, what is first? Or isn't the gender relation already what we're talking about when we talk about inequality in one of the dimensions or in one of those aspects? So,
but difference doesn't mean inequality, right? So I would argue that difference is first and it leads to inequalities.
Different valuations, I would say, lead to inequality, or are basically...
Yeah, evaluations of social categories, for example.
Right.
That's why intersectionality comes in. That would be my point anyways.
Yeah, sure. So work with intersectionality if this works for you, sure. I have no disagreement at all about this. I would just say that in more conceptual terms, like when we think about it theoretically, why is, for example, the unequal valuation of the genders, why isn't that going away under capitalism? I would say it is because those unequal valuations are profitable in the first place. That doesn't mean that the gender relation or those unequal relations only exist in capitalism. Of course not. They have a very long trajectory, but they are useful for capital. So that's why they are exploited. That's why they are reproduced over and over again. Because it's important, for example, for capital that you have, for example, a certain group of the population, and you term them and you say, those should be the women, because this is kind of like obvious, they do the reproduction work. This isn't paid. So this is kind of like cheap labor, in a sense, for the whole society that isn't paid for. You know, that helps capital accumulation a lot.
But we don't just live in capitalism, we also live under patriarchal structures. So there you have the gender factor again. I think if we only focus on class, then we have discussions that say, well, women choose freely to be sold to be married to somebody. Do you know what I mean? I think it is very important to add those aspects. It's not just a choice to find intersectionality interesting or nice to work with. I think this is very important to add to the debate.
Yeah, okay.
Anyways, who's next?
I don't know.
I think we should put a little bit more systems in the discussion, because we are now close to the fact that we are mixing descriptive language and explanatory language, and on the third thing is that there are normative assumptions. And so I would propose that we make it a little bit simpler. If we make a descriptive language, I think the inequality concept is very good because it's multifaceted and, for example, different from poverty. But if taking that, I think it's a little bit too encompassing. For example, related to gender, religion, ethnicity, I would say some parts of these differences are horizontal, whereas others are vertical. And talking of inequality, I would skip out, I would leave it as multifaceted almost, but I would reduce it a little bit. For example, I would reduce the horizontal aspects of differences which also exist between ethnicities, for example. Usually there's a hierarchy, but for example, if you compare Thai Lui and Thai Hom, for example, in Thailand and parts of India, they would probably be on the same level. So, but differentiated on the horizontal level. So I would say, I would tell the encompassing term, I would say, is diversity. And then we have, on the one hand, difference, which may be on the horizontal scale, and we have inequality, which is inequality on a vertical scale. And then we can take into account intersectionality. And I would say intersectionality is about these inequality relations, plus an attention to categories, yeah, race, sex, and so on. That is not only continuing difference, but it's about categories. And intersectionality says the categories belong causally together, and then we can have a quarrel whether gender or race, for example, are the major factors. Yeah. So, but my plea would be, especially if we're talking about methods and working in the field trips, we should a little bit be careful what is descriptive language and what is more, let's say, what is more causally arguing explanatory language, and on the same thing, what we like. And there are people on this planet who like hierarchies. Not only the upper ones, there are places on this planet where even the lower ones are affirming the hierarchies.
Symbolic violence.
Yeah, and the last point, Bourdieu, his main works, his main examples were academia. So we here in this moment are a part of your topic. Yeah,
yeah,
because
of course.
some people can speak native English, and some people like myself not, and others have experiences with conferences, and others less. So we are part of your topic.
Sure, there's inequality all around here. You still have about 10 minutes to lunch, so...
So my question is rather to a point you discussed. So concerning your understanding of gender, I would like to ask you whether you think that as soon as we could overcome capitalism, that gender inequality would be achieved. No, gender equality would be achieved. Because as far as I understood you, you would say it's all combined within capitalism.
Well, right now.
Yeah. So
right now.
So does it mean as soon as we can overcome capitalism, gender equality will be achieved?
It's maybe a question of what overcoming really means. So if we could really get like to a utopian society, then maybe there wouldn't be unequal valuations of the genders, perhaps, because it wouldn't be about like different sorts of people having different kinds of values. That shouldn't be the case, maybe, which doesn't mean that there aren't any differences. Diversity would still be there, or it might still be there. I mean, it's actually up to our imaginations, I guess. I have no idea how a post-capitalist society would look like. But in terms of like an exploitation relation between the genders, that should be done away with, I think. Otherwise, we are going to live in another kind of like shitty society that's not capitalism anymore, but something else.
But you already mentioned that patriarchy already existed before capitalism, so I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, that might be done away with as well. I mean, this is really a utopian question. I don't know how to really answer that. What do you think?
I don't think so. I think that's two different concepts, and they are not that the capitalism is, as you mentioned, that it's using like it's for the capitalism good that there are gender inequality, but I don't think that it will be abolished.
I wouldn't even say that in principle it matters for capital whether you're male or whether you're female. Like in principle it doesn't. It's just like the existing unequal relation between men and women, for example, that is already there, is convenient to exploit by capitalism. And is reproduced and maintained by capitalism. But in principle, capital, I would say, is blind actually to genders as well as to where you come from, whether you're a refugee or not. I mean, you see with the whole refugee crisis, for example, the economic liberals, they are actually, they don't have a problem with refugees. They wouldn't even argue that we have to keep all those people out. So it's more because in society there are those unequal relations already there. That's why it makes sense for capital to stress those differences all the time. My idea. Hypothesis.
Any further questions?
Hi. I actually wanted to relate to Oliver Pai's answer or response to my question, but I didn't get the chance. So, like you say, there's still like even strategic groups are describing some kind of change, that they are changing a already existing system, but these people are already in a higher position of social, cultural, and economic capital. So these people just want to change the system, and that way that they can extend their power and building up new power relations, and then they are reproducing themselves to keep up their power. So it's not going to change the inequality or of the system which already existed before. They are still keeping, like, even if the new people in power, they are keeping other peoples down to stay in power. So it's not going to change the problem at all, even if there are people changing something.
Okay, I want to ask something. Actually, I'm a practical person, so can you give me more understanding about the power of leaders in participation and how to minimize the powerlessness by participation in local community when they are lack of awareness in project development, in understanding in like village development? Because sometimes in my opinion, like inequality, political situation, and whatever it is, sometimes it's too abstract. Thank you.
True. So, did I get that correctly? The role of or the power of village leaders in village development, right? That's also a very general question. Well, I would say. Or which kinds of leaders do you mean, like village elites or development experts or
local leader? Because
local
it's
leaders.
related to the political and participation and how to minimize the powerlessness.
Well, I mean, I could maybe just answer from my empirical experience when it came to like working on nature conservation and ecotourism and all those things in Laos. I had the feeling that those local inequalities, if you want, like you have a village elite and then you have like other kinds of groups that are a little bit less powerful, that this tended to kind of like discourage or counteract the ideas of participation, crucially, actually. So it was regularly the village leaders who exploited their powerful positions to secure their assets in the first place. And even when there was a community-based ecotourism program coming in, claiming to want to include everyone, and you make a big plenum of like all people in the village, then it will still be like power structures involved that lead to certain people answering or speaking up, and other people either not speaking up or just like telling the same stuff the powerful guy had said already, for example. And it seemed to be, even for such development projects that really tried to kind of like bring the local community in, they tended to access in the first place the more powerful and the really the least or the ones most left behind. They were also tended to be left behind by the project as well, because there was no other way of doing of going about and really like realizing a project, because they were always dependent on people who had a certain mindset. This goes back to Bourdieu again, that already had, for example, I don't know, good houses to house tourists and all those things. So they actually had to build on certain kinds of inequalities that, yes, some community members could participate and others not really. So, but it might depend really on the personality of the village or of the local leader. You know, you might have village leaders who really want or are really looking for like more democratic structures in their localities, and then that may work otherwise. But it, like, at least to my experience, that really depends on the very personality of the guy who leads the village and the persons who form and form the village elite. I don't know if this answers the question.
Okay, thank you.
So it's lunchtime. Are you hungry? We can go on. So we have 1 hour. At 1 o'clock,